Just us.
It's
Just us.
I feel like I'm so slow.
Why? This is fine. It's good. What do you mean slow?
Like I just wish I was moving faster.
No. If you do that, then you miss. Hi, Shay.
Hi, Kristen. How are you?
Because I feel like if you move too fast, then you jump over stuff that's important. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote down, this was my reflection of what you had said. Well, I'm sorry. I'm just,
I know
I
that's
mean, there's
great.
a lot there. So it's like, I don't think you're going too slow. I think it's good to be able to, you know, soak up what's there.
Just waiting on Amy.
Hola.
There we go. We're all back. Okay.
Who was that asked me if I got my hair cut? Like between,
Odie.
I felt like when we got on, somebody was like, did you cut your hair? I'm like, no, it's literally back there, people. I didn't like get like a little, so.
Kristen, you didn't get that cut like from Great Clips.
Oh my gosh. Teo, I told Teo about that, about my nightmare haircut situation. And how you guys
But you
tried to
did have
highlight
that
it.
haircut for a long time, though.
No.
He cracks me
Are
up.
you sure?
Yeah. I didn't have that. That one I got when they were with me was like this
I was
short. Yeah, it was like a boy cut. The lady kept cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting. And Mom left me there, thanks, to just deal with my own, telling them what cut
what
to
the
give. And then I
heck?
came out and it was like this short and I was bawling.
And Amy was
Oh,
like,
my God.
oh, we'll highlight it. It'll be fine. We'll just highlight it.
And it was so short they couldn't get it pulled through that little cap thing.
And that's when you had to
boy
wear
cut.
a headband just so that you look like a girl.
Thank you, Melinda.
I did do that from age like 0 to 4 because I didn't have hair.
Yeah. Oh, unfortunately, I was like in, 4th or 5th grade, which really. Oh. Okay, that was a little bit of a
Odie.
side note.
Yeah, some comic relief. Okay, so back to where were we? We were talking about verse 7. Any thoughts on what I just said about how like Paul is kind of equating his suffering with also what advancing the gospel? Gospel.
So I have a question, or Shelby and I do.
Yeah.
So are you saying that God can use a bad situation and turn it into good? Or that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Just
I mean,
making sure that's
What, that I'm not saying that Paul was imprisoned to preach the gospel? That I'm not saying that? I'm saying what Paul is saying. That's what I'm saying. I mean, I guess I don't know what you're trying to ask.
I think what Mom's asking is, and I could be wrong, but if Mom is asking like that because he's in prison, and so God is using that opportunity to he's able to use his suffering, right? This experience to, to point people to Jesus because he's in this situation. I think that's what Mom's asking, if you're right, or am I wrong?
yes, you're right.
So versus the idea that, not the idea, but I guess the flip side of that would be that, God put him in prison for the point of advancing the gospel. Is that what you're saying? Like these two different things?
Right. So I'm not going to comment on that except for to read to you what Paul says. So then you can come up with what you think that means. Does that make sense? So I'm just going to tell you what Paul says from verse. So I have written down, he repeats imprisonment 4 times in chapter 1. In verse 7, which we just talked about, in verse 13, he says, I want you to know, well, I'm going to start at 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. So we have him saying that. Then in verse 14, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak without the word without fear. So that's 14. And then 17, oh, this is like the former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to inflict me in my imprisonment. So that's not really, that doesn't really pertain to what you're asking that last time. So what are your thoughts based on that?
Well, based on that, I would say God put him in prison. Based on those verses. But I think we have to remember too that if you think, I mean, I think of missionaries, even in today's time or over the last, 2,000 years, that have been called to places that have been very, very difficult to go minister in, and they've suffered a lot to be called to those places. So I think we have to remember
You're cutting out.
some sufferings
Your internet
are not the
sucks.
same as
You're cutting.
Your internet.
Well, you're also using Disney Plus right now.
Sorry.
Which probably doesn't help.
Yeah.
It makes her sound
Frozen.
like an animated character.
We had no idea what you just said.
No idea.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. We can hear you, but it's like you sound like a robot.
Mm.
It'll start out strong and then it like slowly fades away.
Is the
Try
video
again.
Brad, are you off the internet now?
Oh my gosh.
So what you're saying is that what Paul is saying here, it sounds like he's saying that he's being imprisoned for Christ. That God put him in prison. That's what it sounds like what he's saying. Right? You can just like nod. Okay. Okay. So let's just go with that's what Paul is saying here. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like I get what you're saying, but my hesitation to jump into comparing it to missionaries here is that's what we're kind of trying to avoid, jumping to our own interpretation based on our own experiences and what we know, and letting the text tell us how to interpret what Paul is saying. Does that make sense? I'm not trying to change like change anybody's theology or what they believe about who God is and how suffering fits into Christianity. My goal, or my challenge, not my goal, I don't know how to word it, but is, and we talked about this when we first, our first time that we did this, was that we want to come to this with open minds and like set aside our preconceived ideas and let the text speak for itself, right? I mean, are we good with that? I don't want to step on any toes, but I want Paul to have the space to say what he's saying.
I think he's just saying that it was opportunity, that he happened to be in prison and that now it has served really well to advance the gospel, and he has joy in that imprisonment because it is for Christ.
Yeah.
So true.
I think it's hard to, and this is just me personally, like when I read this specifically, it's hard to be able to say that unless, and I'm not looking at literal translation here, you know what I mean? But it's like, to me, it says, this has served to advance the gospel. It doesn't necessarily say like, God has placed me here and he put me in this situation on purpose for this, right? I feel like what it says to me when I'm looking at it is that he is suffering, and in the suffering, he is holding on to hope and he's being joyful in it, and it has served a purpose. You know what I mean? Like, because I mean, it says in that the verse that we read, verse 12, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that has become known to the whole guard. You know, and it's like, so it's to me, when I read that, it's like, so what has happened to him? This is what has happened to him. This is the world he lives in. This is the culture he lives in right now that has imprisoned him for these reasons. And then this is how it's being used. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, it's hard for me, and I don't know what you know, Mel, as far as the studying through it goes. I just think it's hard for me, in all honesty, to look at this and to read exactly the words that are there. I think 100% that he's saying, I'm suffering, and part of following Jesus is going through suffering. We can see that through this and other things, you know, but it's like, I don't know if I can read these words that we're reading right now and say, God put me right here in this prison because of this. You know what I mean? Because I don't feel like, honestly, I don't feel like what words are there are actually saying that. I think he's saying, this is what has happened to me, and this is how I have preached Jesus in the midst of that. And it's like, does that make sense? It's hard for me to read literally that, like what like that he's saying God put him here, because I feel like he's not saying that. You know what I mean? I don't feel like he's saying God did this to me. Like, those words aren't there. He's saying, this is where I am, and this is what has happened to me, so that, you know.
Right. And I think the truth that we do know, go ahead, Mom. Sorry.
To say, Shelby just said a good statement. She said, because of what Paul believes in is why he's in prison. Because of his bold faith. That's why he's in prison. That's why they put him in prison, right? Yeah.
Right. And I think that you can even see that in verse, where was I? In verse 14, where he says, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. You know, when he talks about that, he's saying, you know, I knew what this was going to cost me. I knew what speaking the word. And if you read through Acts, which I highly encourage to do, actually, the time that I taught this before, when Mom and Shelby were kind of there, I don't know if Shelby was there, but Mom was for sure, to the ladies' Bible study. That was the pre-thing that we did, was we read through the book of Acts before we even started into Philippians, to give us a good mindset of the life of what Paul went through in Acts with all the churches and his suffering and all the persecution, which I think gives a better understanding. It gives a very good place to put the letters of Paul and to understand what he's talking about. And so I say that to say, like he knew that he was going to suffer. He knew by speaking the truth that he was going to be persecuted, because guess who didn't like him? The same people who didn't like Jesus. You know, that was the first opposition of Paul, and they tried to do the same thing to Paul that they did to Jesus. And Paul was imprisoned a lot, beaten a lot. Like, he went through a lot of suffering, and even though he wasn't as powerful as Jesus, obviously Son of God, and couldn't just like escape it like that, he could have stopped. That's the thing. He could have stopped, and he could have said, I'm done with this. No more. You know, and I think that is the point, is the bigger picture point than whether or not God put him in prison or he is in prison. Because when we start getting into these details, I think we're taking away from the bigger point that Paul is trying to make. The bigger point that Paul is trying to make is that I'm not going to stop doing what I know to do and saying what I know God is calling me to say and being who I know God has called me to be, because I'm suffering. You know what I mean? And just because I'm suffering doesn't mean that it's not, that what I'm doing is wrong, or I'm out of line of my calling or what God has called me to. It's like Mom said, God can turn good things out of suffering, but just because you're experiencing suffering doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you or your faith, or you've made a wrong decision. Like, and I think that those are the dangerous things that at least I had grown up believing about suffering and trials and illness or whatever it is that can cause us pain in our life, that it means that I'm less of a Christian or I'm not following God in the way that I should be, and it's my fault, and then it's some sort of punishment from God or punishment in some way because I'm not serving God in the way that I should be, or I missed it somewhere. Do you see the difference in that and how Paul is like kind of more talking along those lines than necessarily saying or even choosing between that? And I think that that's sometimes the what is the word I'm looking for? The trap that we fall into is like we're asking scripture to answer questions that it's not intending to answer. And we're imposing these questions on scripture that aren't answerable in this section. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and just to to go along with what you're saying, Mel, is that there's no answer here to that question of we do not know if God put him there or he didn't put him there, because it's literally not, God's not in there giving us the answer to that. You know what I mean? In this, he you know what I mean? It's like, I don't know. Anyways.
Yeah, right. That's good. I think that, like I said, go ahead, Amy.
Well, I'm just thinking about our nephew Blake, who actually was in prison, for 7-8 years. And how Blake, that changed him, and he tells us when we would go visit him, he's like, I'm thankful that I was imprisoned because I probably would be dead. This changed his life. So whether God put him there, I mean, his choices put him there, because of the things that he did, but it was used, like Renee was saying and everything, for good, because it changed who he was. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's even, I'm just thinking about our actual experience with, someone being in prison. I'm trying to relate the two together. So I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah.
And almost even like what we're going through right now, because we wouldn't be doing this study if we weren't going through we would not be home and available. And so now we're using this opportunity to study together, which I think is cool. So even in our day right now, we're using maybe this not so great opportunity. We're using it as for a good thing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So we only have like 3 minutes, and I definitely wanted to get through all of chapter 1. We didn't do that. We're still on the first page. So is there any other final thoughts that anybody wants to share just from today? I'm just looking at this. I think we'll start probably we did talk a lot about verse 12 and through 14, so maybe we'll start with verse 15 on Tuesday, if that works for everybody, that same time and everything. Because the rest of that little portion of verse 8 and 9, it's just really saying just Paul's hope for them. It's just his hope for their growth, pretty much. And it's still just in that Thanksgiving prayer. We're not even to the body of what Paul is really trying to say. If you remember that we talked about that Paul starts with the greeting and then the prayer of Thanksgiving, which was typical of a letter back then. So he's just like saying, I'm thankful for you for these reasons, which is great. And his kind of hope for them and in more of like a broader sense. And then it's in verse 12 where he really starts getting into his point of writing. So since we've already been through that, we'll start at verse 15. before I have to go, or we all have to go, what was I going to say? Oh, any thoughts?
Can we have like what can we be kind of really focusing in on? Maybe just the rest of chapter 1 and kind of pulling out some of what we just did now?
Yeah.
Like the same kind of thing? Okay.
Yeah. Just, yeah. Or just, I mean, I think you can do that, or just meditating on and thinking about just the things that we've talked about today. And like, how does that, like, what is that? How do you interpret that further into your own life? You know what I'm saying? Like, how do you take some of the things that we've just talked about, and how does that translate into a timeless truth for your life? And then how can you apply that to your life, just in your own personal, I don't know, what quiet time, if you call it that, or meditation, or when you're thinking about this, like, and you can go through the rest of chapter 1 and think about some other things that we talked about, kind of the same sort of deal that we did today.
That's in record.
All right.
So we're going to concentrate on the rest of 1 and into 2.
Just one. I would say just 1 is fine.
Okay.
Or yeah. And and think about just some of the things that we've talked about today. If you can come up with some timeless truths to share the next time, and maybe some applications for your own life, or for our first or 21st century lives, like, that would be great. If you want to do that and have something to share, and then we'll just try to get through. We should be fine to get through the rest of chapter 1 on a Tuesday. Work fine for everybody? We good? Yeah, Tuesday 10.
Right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah. Love
Bye.
you guys.
Love you
Yeah.
guys.
Bye. Love. Bye.
Bye.
Hi, guys. Are you getting off too? Oh, I gotta go. I'm being called. Sorry. See ya.
Well, what about you guys? Hey guys.